Thank you very much, and thank you for coming. I would like to echo the acknowledgement of the Indigenous owners of the land on which we meet this evening and pay my respects to elders past and present. So I want to talk, I'm going to talk a little bit about, I guess, what you might call a political philosophy approach to hate speech and the boundaries of free speech, or appropriate boundaries of free speech. This is obviously a very controversial topic, one that I've spent, I think now 25 years researching. So I'm going to frame it around the sort of theoretical justifications for free speech, but then go more into the kind of scholarship. And I want to finish on some really contemporary challenges in this area. So I'll just do this very briefly, but just for clarity, for purposes of clarity, in the literature, there's a variety of arguments, but the four most core arguments as to why free speech deserves to be protected, these four arguments: democracy, autonomy, truth, and suspicion of government. The fourth one is much more prevalent in the United States, of course, than in other countries, and has deeply informed both the wording of and the subsequent jurisprudential interpretation of the First Amendment. So the argument from democracy is, of course, very easily understood. The idea is that you don't have a real democracy unless citizens broadly conceived, not narrowly in the legal sense, but members of the polity have to have the ability to engage in discussion and debate around political issues that matter to them, so that they can form a view of what they think, what they believe, not just how they want to vote, but how they want to jointly construct society. So the argument from democracy privileges what might be called political speech or political discourse, although that term is extraordinarily difficult to define. In some cases where speech is said to undermine democracy, the versions of the argument democracy would say that there are legitimate reasons to regulate that speech. So a good example is disinformation, which is now defined as the deliberate use of misinformation, primarily online, in order to undermine core institutions and to harm society, to harm democracy. So there's at least theoretically, philosophically, a valid reason to regulate it, although in practice, of course, it's extraordinarily difficult to do that, because defining disinformation, as I just did, is easy, but identifying disinformation in the public sphere is extraordinarily difficult, and trying to regulate it in a way that doesn't constitute what you might call an overbroad regulation of free speech, one that infringes too much on free speech. That's the real challenge in practice, and that's extraordinarily difficult to do. There are also others who say that regulating speech prejudges the speech that ends up in the public sphere, and that inherently, the argument from democracy therefore implies that inherently you should leave as broad a category of speech as possible to be free, because you don't want to prejudge that public sphere. It's actually up to the public sphere to determine what it wants to have in the public sphere, not up to government or regulators. The autonomy or self-fulfillment argument is that as human beings, we need to be able to develop our individual capacities to think and to plan and to organise our own lives. And so there are various versions of the autonomy argument. The truth argument in a non-sophisticated version says it's through public deliberation that we engage in a search for truth, as in we learn that the moon is not made of cheese and that the earth is not flat. But we know, of course, in the social and political arena that version of the argument from truth fails empirically, because there's abundant evidence in world politics that public discourse does not result in the primacy of truth. So there are more sophisticated versions of the argument from truth, which still derive from John Stuart Mill. That one is that the assumption of infallibility, even if we believe that what we know is true, particularly in the social and political sphere, we don't 100% know that we're right, and so we can't assume that we're infallible. So we still have to engage in debate over ideas. And the second, more sophisticated version is the dead dogma idea, as in John Stuart Mill said, we shouldn't hold our views as dead dogma. We need to be able to rationally and argumentatively defend why it is beliefs that we hold, the views that we hold, and for that, free speech is indispensable. The fourth argument is obviously very clear. A suspicion of government, it deeply informs First Amendment jurisprudence. You can't trust government to regulate speech because they will get it wrong and they will overreach. And I say that deeply informs the First Amendment, but there's also enormous amounts of empirical evidence in support of the idea that when governments have leeway to restrict speech, their preference is to over-restrict speech. And I could give you countless examples of over-restriction of speech in the Australian context where we lack an explicit federal constitutional or statutory free speech protection, and we have this kind of hodgepodge mix and match approach to protecting free speech in Australia, and as a result have really significant examples in relation to protest, for example, or allegedly terrorist speech, for example, and numerous other things where the government has overstepped. So their argument around hate, so that's why free speech is important. There's an argument around hate speech that tries to define hate speech in a way that says hate speech is harmful to all of those things. Hate speech is harmful to the development of individual autonomy because it directly harms the individuals who are its targets and the communities to which they belong. And it harms them in ways that prevent them from being able to develop in fully autonomous ways. It harms the search for truth because it deploys tropes, racist tropes, for example, into the public sphere. And it certainly harms democracy by marginalising and excluding some people from being able to participate with equal opportunity in public debate. And there is therefore widely around the world, with the exception of the United States, a view that hate speech can and should be justifiably regulated because it doesn't fulfil those purposes for the protection of free speech and it actually harms the public sphere. So there's a counter-argument that as I said before, you can't prejudge the public sphere and it's up to the public sphere to make that argument, to work out what it wants, and that some much hate speech, even though we find it abhorrent and horrible, nevertheless is a contribution to public debate. And that's a serious argument that's made by serious scholars who recognise that there are harms to hate speech, but who say that nevertheless, because it's core political discourse, when somebody puts up a sign in their restaurant saying, "I won't serve black people here," that's a political statement. That's not just an expression of their opinion, although it is. It's also a political statement in a particular context in which historically it was possible to put up that sign and in which that sign instantiated a racist hierarchy in that community. So that makes it a very political statement. And so there are some who say, yes, hate speech harms, but at the same time it's core political discourse and so we can't regulate it. So so if you accept the premise, and many people do, including First Amendment defenders, many of those, the most sensible ones, do accept that hate speech can harm. So how can it harm? The literature says it can harm in two ways. It can harm causally and constitutively. It harms causally by having a causal relationship with subsequent events that happen to that person. So it can prevent somebody from engaging in public discourse by marginalising them, for example. It can cause fear and intimidation. It can cause a loss of associative liberty where people are scared to hang out with other members of their community, or even allies of theirs become scared to hang out with them in case they become targeted. It can cause, of course, overt discrimination in things like housing, jobs, the provision of public goods and services. And at its worst, of course, it can incite violence. And again, there's ample evidence historically around the world that certain types of hate speech have a causal relationship with, not just a coincidental, but also arguably a causal relationship with violence. And in fact, the United Nations, the parts of the United Nations that are concerned with atrocity crimes are now looking very carefully at the kinds of speech patterns and language use which have been identified as very likely precursors to violence. one of which is relegating a certain section of the community to being treated like animals, particularly vermin or insects. Another one is associating a certain section of the community with viruses, with the danger of viruses and dangerous risk to the rest of society. There's a great project by Susan Benesch called the Dangerous Speech Project, which is linked in with that work in the United Nations. So we know that the causal argument is pretty strong. Then there's the constitutive argument, and this one is more controversial, but many people, including myself, find it persuasive. So the constitutive argument says that just in saying the hate speech, you've harmed people, even if the targets, even if nothing else, as in discrimination in a job or violence, happens afterwards. And the reason that that can happen is that hate speech happens in contexts, and as we all know, in contexts like countries like Australia, liberal democratic orders around the world. So in those societies, discrimination is systemic. There are groups within those societies that suffer from systemic discrimination and marginalisation. And so hate speech doesn't occur in a vacuum. Hate speech occurs in that context. And in a context where racism, for example, is systemic, an act of racist hate speech is a perpetuation of that racism. It's an assertion that that systemic discrimination is valid in the eyes of the person speaking, and it's an exhortation on the people who are listening to buy into that worldview. So it performs an act of subordination. A racist act of hate speech in a context within which racism exists as a systemic form of discrimination is an act of subordination. It ranks, and the kinds of things that constitutively it does is rank the targets and their communities as inferior, legitimate discriminatory behaviour against them, and silences them constitutively. Constitutive silencing means that so causal silencing is people are too scared to speak back, right, to engage in counter speech. That's causal silencing. Constitutive silencing is people still can express their words, but their words don't achieve the force they want them to achieve. So they can say, it's not fair to say those things about us, or stop, or I want to protect my kids, or you're wrong about that, but it doesn't achieve the effect they want it to achieve. That is to say, the speaker who uttered the speech act still propagates racism or anti-Semitism or whatever the case may be in that context. And the words, we hear this from the lived experience of communities who are targeted by discrimination, that they try and speak back, or they try and say no, or they try, and when they do try, they feel as though they're not listened to. They feel as though their words don't have the effect that they want them to. So that's constitutive silencing. These harms occur at every level. They occur at the level of individuals, of course, who are targeted or who are family members of or friends of, or have a close personal relationship with individuals who are targeted. It harms the communities to which they belong, and by that I don't only mean the community that shares their identity, I mean the broader community, and it also harms democracy by marginalising people and excluding them from public debate, either constitutively or causally. So there's a pretty significant body of harms if you accept this body of work, if you accept this hypothesis or set of arguments. I mentioned before that the evidence on harms is nevertheless highly contested. And it's contested in three ways. It's contested empirically, philosophically, and normatively, in the sense of whether that harm is or is not a sufficient basis for regulation. So I'll just talk about that for a little bit. The ideas around the empirical challenges to the evidence on the harms essentially say you can't get the evidence for this. You can argue persuasively using theories that this is what happens, but you can't get the evidence. Some people, in fact, go harder than that and say this is just completely methodologically unsound and you're extrapolating from interpersonal situations and it's rhetorical empiricism. But more sensible people say, firstly, it's very difficult to distinguish in real life studies between the effects of exposure to systemic discrimination and the effects of exposure to hate speech. So every time you do a study asking people about their exposure to hate speech, their lived experience also is informed by the fact that they've been exposed to other forms of discrimination. And it's very, very hard to disaggregate those things. You can ask them specifically, some studies do ask them specifically about their experiences with hate speech, but it's a methodological challenge for those of us interested in scholarship. Secondly, some people say it's just paternalistic to say that targets of hate speech have these responses and have these effects, psychological effects and so on. It's just paternalistic. It's absolutely not true. There are plenty of people who are targeted by hate speech who respond by being galvanised into action or determined to prove their detractors wrong. The third issue, which I've already mentioned, is causality. It's very difficult to establish a causal connection between someone experiencing hate speech and then how they tell you they feel. I mean, it's not impossible, but it's difficult. You have to recognise that we're dealing with human beings here in this type of research, and it's difficult to establish causality. There are even people who would challenge the causality of the way the Nazis talked about Jews and what happened in the Holocaust. I mean, you would think that's a pretty clear causal connection, but there are even people who say, well, yeah, okay, it's plausible, but we still haven't, we can't prove it. On the other side, of course, there are people who say that there are plenty of empirics. These criticisms are invalid. Firstly, we have the comments by people who've had the lived experience and a very strong body of literature from within, for example, critical race theory, talking about the effects of being exposed to hate speech. And secondly, we have studies that use particularly qualitative methods, particularly interviews and focus groups, to ask these communities what their experiences of hate speech have been, including studies that I have done myself, which all, to my knowledge, support the hypothesis that these are the harms that hate speech causes. Philosophically, there's a challenge to whether this argument is persuasive or not, and I won't spend much time on that one. Obviously, the argument I've just told you about constitutive harm in particular is just challenged by people who say, I just don't buy that. I just don't buy this notion of constitutive harm. Yes, racist hate speech, for example, happens in a context where systemic discrimination happens, but there's always challenges to systemic discrimination. There's always agency to challenge it, and people do challenge it, and change does happen, and policy change happens, and changes to attitudes happen, and you're discounting all of that. You're kind of victimising these targets by saying, well, somebody like me would respond to that by saying it doesn't have to happen to every target every single time in order for the argument about harms to be valid. But nevertheless, they're a philosophical contestation. And then, of course, there's a question of whether the harm itself is a sufficient basis for regulation, not because the harm isn't bad, but because there are harms of regulating. So this is an argument that if you allow government to start regulating hate speech, then you create new harms. So if you leave hate speech unregulated, the harms are incurred on the targets and their communities primarily, and you're asking them to bear the burden of those harms. But if you start regulating hate speech as well, you create different types of harms. So first is that one I mentioned about presupposing the terms of the debate. You're taking components out of the debate and you don't know what that's going to do to public discourse, and that might well weaken and make public discourse much less robust. And the second one is actually a very clear argument that taking those things, prejudging and taking them out of debate, actually undermines democratic legitimacy. Processes of democratic legitimation are absolutely premised on the public's ability to say what they think about policy. So opponents of same-sex marriage, for example, need to be able to say that they oppose same-sex marriage in the lead up to in a non-vilifying way in a lead up to a plebiscite, because eventually the plebiscite and then will happen, and then the parliament will enact a law, and they might disagree with that law. But we still have to persuade them that in a democratic society, you still have to follow laws with which you disagree. Because if everybody goes around saying, I don't agree with that law, I'm not going to follow it. I mean, all proportions guarded, right? We have civil disobedience. I respect that. But on the whole, you can't say, well, I'm not going to pay my taxes because I don't agree with that tax law. And I'm not going to abide by anti-discrimination law because I didn't get a say, right? I don't like it and I'm not going to abide by it. We expect everybody to abide by anti-discrimination law, and we expect everybody to abide by tax law. And one of the reasons that we expect people to do that is because there's been a legitimate process of democratic legitimation, a valid process of democratic legitimation, in which people could have their say, even if they disagreed with the policy being enacted. So the argument is that if you take hate speech out of that, then you've prejudged that discourse and you've prevented people having their say. And if you've prevented people having their say, they have less reason to obey the law. They have less reason to view that law as legitimate. Now, the counter-argument to that is you're only taking out the vilifying stuff. They can still express their view. So a really good example is, in my view, it is not an act of hate speech to say, due to my religious belief, I do not support same-sex marriage. In my view, it is an act of hate speech to say, due to my religious views, I believe that gays are going to burn in hell and they have no place on this earth. That is an act of vilification because it says they have no right to membership of the community. They should not exist. But the first one was an expression of view on policy. So I think the weakness in that democratic legitimation challenge is that it is still possible to participate in public debate in ways that don't vilify. And I think that distinction has been lost in Australian political debate, absolutely lost, thanks to the debate we had around same-sex marriage and religious freedom. This is the second last slide. So I'm moving now to kind of ongoing problems in this debate. One problem in this debate is capacious definitions of hate speech. The definition I've given you, where I've connected hate speech to systemic discrimination, is narrow. There are a whole bunch of people, including people conducting surveys into people's experiences of hate speech, who worryingly use a very capacious definition. And certainly in the media and in public debate these days, a lot of people use the shorthand of hate or have experienced hate to claim to have been victimised by hate speech. And where those claims do not bear any relationship to systemic discrimination, I don't call it hate speech. It is not my view that anything that makes you feel uncomfortable or that you think is really nasty, and some things are super nasty, that doesn't make it hate speech just because it was super nasty. There's lots of super nasty stuff. There's lots of things that make us feel uncomfortable. That doesn't make it hate speech. Again, that differentiation is being lost, really significantly lost in important ways in public debate, where all kinds of people say they've been subjected to hate on all kinds of grounds if you look at the surveys. And then the final challenge is, or set of challenges, is around the free speech, a broadening of the free speech principle. So the free speech principle sounds simple, but because it covers speech, but it doesn't cover all speech. There have always been instances of speech that are not covered by free speech principles. Perjury is a really good example. There is no free speech defence to committing perjury. You can't say, but it's my free speech. You commit perjury, that's regarded as so terrible that it's outside the coverage of free speech principles. Defamation, outside the coverage of free speech principles. Child sex abuse material, outside the coverage of free speech protection, right? So we've hived off a bunch of things which, even though they're related to speech, we just don't protect. So free speech doesn't protect everything. Burning your draft card, outside the principles. Free speech doesn't protect everything. But right now, there's a concerted attempt by conservatives globally to extend the free speech principle to cover expressive conduct that otherwise would not be protected. And the paradigmatic case of that is the baker. The baker who was asked to bake by clients, paid by clients to make a wedding cake, and refused to make a wedding cake for a same-sex couple because he said, I don't agree in same-sex marriage. This is my expression. The making of the cake is my expression, and therefore I'm going to violate anti-discrimination laws, which require me to provide a service to you on an equal basis, and I'm going to violate anti-discrimination laws by saying it's my free speech. So I don't have time to go into the details, but the principle there is that the concept of what is being covered by a free speech principle is getting expanded by conservatives. This is happening in abortion in relation to information about abortion. It's been happening in relation to the provision of services to LGBTQIA+ communities, florists, photographers, venue hire, bakers, all of them. It's a very organised campaign. And my fear is that if a free speech principle gets extended to cover everything, then it covers nothing. And we have to still have a sensible way of differentiating between what is covered by a free speech principle and what is not. Otherwise, we're risking free speech itself. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Cap. And I've actually felt such a sense of discomfort even listening to the things that you study. I'm so grateful that there are people like you that are thinking really deeply about the moral boundary of these actions. When I study that kind of behavior, of course, I benefit from the moral luxury of condemning the group, or perhaps of siding with it and really diving deep. Thank you so much. Anyways, there's another person now who's going to speak, and I'll ask you, Michal, to share your screens, and we'll just put you on a speaker view as well. Professor Bilewicz speaks with personal as well as professional experience of the boundary between free speech and hate speech, in the sense that some of us as psychologists know that his career has been debated in the media in Poland, and the legitimacy of his own research has been challenged by people coming from an anti-Semitic perspective. So I'm not sure if you're going to speak about that, Michal, but I just want to say, as someone that's put your moral courage where your research is. Now, I'm not actually showing your video. It's fine if you don't want to share your screen, but I just wanted to say that. Oh no, there we go. Sorry. I've just
I hope you can see the screen now, right?
We can see the screen and we can see you speaking. So thank you so much for being here and for being part of our discussion. Over to you.
Okay, thank you very much for inviting me, and it's an honor to speak after Professor Gelber, whom I cited a lot and never thought that there will be occasion to meet and discuss and share very different perspectives. But what I think I'm going to talk about is quite complementary to some themes that she raised in her talk. I will not talk about my own experiences, and of course I should be a very strong advocate of free speech, as this is the value which is certainly under threat in my country. But I'm a psychologist, and today I will focus mostly on the outcomes of research that we've been doing on hate speech in my research group. So, of course, this debate around hate speech and free speech has been very vibrant in recent months after the purchase of Twitter by Elon Musk, where Elon Musk explicitly said that he's going to defend the freedom of speech on Twitter. He made several changes in the policy of Twitter in terms of moderation. He reopened several accounts that were previously banned for spreading derogatory language, like President Donald Trump's account on Twitter, Jordan Peterson, and several others that were very much debated because of spreading derogatory or offensive messages. And what has been shown recently by Anti-Defamation League is that after the takeover of Twitter, after the purchase of Twitter by Elon Musk, there was a visible increase in the anti-Jewish, anti-Semitic contents on Twitter. So they did this study on by selecting the samples of tweets and automatically indicating through natural language processing the amount of anti-Semitic motifs, and you can see that there is a really large increase within a very short period of time. So this was, I think, 2 months gap. Another thing that Anti-Defamation League did was that something which is quite common, and there are also other institutions doing this kind of interventions, was reporting tweets that are violating Twitter rules for, in this case, anti-Semitic contents, and looking how the Twitter regulates it, so how Twitter responds to those users who are flagging contents, who are reporting hateful contents. And they found that in November, in the early November, just before these changes in Twitter's policies, there will be a lot of response and removals of hateful tweets, but then already 2 weeks later, there will be a massive change that most reactions from Twitter will be completely no reaction, no action, no response to the person who is reporting hateful contents. So here we see these two sides that we've been talking about, this freedom of speech value, which of course refers to the First Amendment in the US, that has been explicitly stated by Elon Musk as justification of the changes that he imposed in Twitter. And on the other hand, we have another value, which is protection of particularly minority groups from the harm which can be caused by or from discrimination that is caused by derogatory language. It is regulated on different levels, so you can see that here there's a conflict, of course, between the American regulations and the more universal laws from the United Nations. And of course, in Europe, we have more strict regulations within the Council of Europe that defines hate speech, and also there are several policies based on that that are trying to regulate hate speech in the country members of the Council of Europe. Okay, so what we as psychologists can add to that, coming back to the distinction proposed by Professor Gelber, I think that we are much more on this causal side. So looking at the consequences of hate speech, and Gordon Allport already in 1950s, in his very famous The Nature of Prejudice, described hate speech as what he called then anti-locutions. So he wrote about derogatory language, and he wrote that using this metaphor of a barking dog, although most barking does not lead to biting, yet there is never a bite without previous barking. So suggesting that this is like the early warning before the serious discrimination or the serious harm is going to happen. And I think that now we are moving towards more interpreting hate as biting itself. So trying to see whether it in fact is a form of abuse and not something that precedes abuse. So where we as psychologists could contribute to this discussion, to this debate between free speech and hate speech, I think that much of this discussion, and this was also discussed in the previous talk, is a discussion about the nature of hate speech. So whether certain expressions of negative attitudes towards minority groups that are very often discriminated in other ways are mere opinions, so part of the political discourse, or they are acts of verbal violence. They are acts of violence committed using different means, not physical aggression, but verbal aggression. And in this discussion or in this debate, we can propose two streams of argumentation. One, we can give evidence about the consequences of hate speech for targeted minorities. So what psychological consequences, what are the psychological consequences of being victim of hate speech? And the second is showing the similarity of the mechanisms that occur when people are exposed to hate speech with other forms of aggression. So we know quite a lot in psychology about other forms of violence and aggression. How do they spread in the society? How do they change people's thinking? How do they change people's behavior and emotion? And we could see whether similar effects can be observed when people are exposed to hate speech or So I will focus now on these two streams, also showing quite some of our own studies on these themes. First, the consequences for targeted minorities. There were very interesting archival studies by Brian Mullen, and here again the question of causality. It's something which you can quite well address in those archival studies because the time passes only in one direction, right? So this is what Mullen and Smith showed, that, and they use the term ethnopholism, but basically we're here, when we are talking about ethnopholism valence, we are talking about the negativity of language which has been used in certain time to describe certain immigrant groups. And in this study, they found that even when in this model, there is a controlled level of suicide rates in home countries of those immigrants, right? So basically here you can see that what they are modeling here is this increase in the suicide rates among different groups of immigrants in Canada. And they found this significant effect of the language which has been used, so this hateful language that has been used about immigrant groups, it really explains the immigrant suicide rates, controlling for different other variables in the model. Again, this is an archival evidence, but we thought that this kind of evidence could be also presented using more actual data of different kinds. So here is one study that I've been doing together with several colleagues for the Fundamental Rights Agency in Europe, and this was a study of Jewish minorities living in different European countries. And we had relatively large samples of Jewish minorities, and we asked them how often do they hear statements about, that Jews are have too much power in their country, that Jews are not loyal citizens in their country, etc., etc. So we gave them examples of most common hate speech, anti-Semitic hate speech. And in this study, we also measured intentions to emigrate, whether people are actively preparing to emigrate from their country. And we found that hate speech was actually significantly related to intentions to emigrate. But in this model, we controlled for all, we thought, very relevant causes for emigration, like, for example, crime level in your country, unemployment level in your country, immigration. There is a lot of discussion that Jews emigrate from different countries in Europe because there is a lot of immigration from the Middle East, and there are tensions and conflicts on that ground, or governmental corruption. So you can see that hate speech, the fact that you're hearing anti-Semitic slurs in your environment, is a stronger antecedent of willingness to emigrate than any other causes that we have assessed in this study. Another case are international students, and I can proudly say that living in a quite ethnically homogeneous country, I work at the university, which is becoming increasingly diverse, and we have approximately 5,000 students who are international students who study at my university, University of Warsaw. And also we did some correlational studies some time ago with the Office for International Students at my university, where we assessed many psychological problems that students might have in adapting in a new environment. So we assessed their mood, psychological well-being, but also we indicated even post-traumatic stress disorder among them. And we found that all of them were significantly correlated with exposure to hate speech that they had while living in Poland. So the ones who have heard some ethnic slurs in their environment you could really see that their negative, they would have more negative mood. It would affect their well-being, etc. The problem here is, of course, and this is a problem that was correctly mentioned by Professor Gelber, that we didn't control for other forms of discrimination. We didn't measure other forms of discrimination, and probably, you know, when as Gordon Alport said, when dog is barking, it's quite possibly he's biting as well at the same time, right? So that's we don't know whether these people were also targeted by other forms of discrimination or aggression or violence. So we did the next series of study in a context which is highly salient now in Poland, because Poland received a large group of refugees from the Ukraine during the war, and the attitudes towards those refugees and immigrants is generally positive and welcoming. Yet still, some incidents of derogation, hatred, you can still see them on internet, but also in everyday situations. Just talking about the numbers, this was a group of more than 1 million of people that came to Poland before 2022. So after, because the war started in 2014, so after this, during this war, we received 1 million refugees and immigrants, more than 1 million, and currently we have received another much more than 1 million. It's we don't have exact numbers. It was up to 2 million at certain time. So basically, it's approximately 10% of the Polish population currently are refugees and immigrants from Ukraine. So this is a really large immigration within a short period of time. We conducted a study of several psychological consequences of hate speech, and we presented Ukrainians with examples of anti-Ukrainian hate speech that we've collected from internet, and we've asked them how often they have experienced these kind of statements in their everyday life in Poland. So we measured hate speech exposure, but we also measured other forms of discrimination in workplace, etc. And we tried to look whether hate speech still has some predictive effect on PTSD symptoms among those immigrants and refugees who are coming from the war zone. In many of them, and we found that in fact hate speech is a significant predictor of PTSD symptoms, even if you controlled for other forms of experienced discrimination. And this is to large extent mediated by acculturation stress. So if you see hate speech in your environment, you start thinking that you will have problems in normal acculturation in this country, that you're not welcomed here, that it creates stresses in your everyday encounters with the host country population, which ultimately leads to PTSD symptoms. Again, this is not a longitudinal study, but we found this both for PTSD symptoms and for depression symptoms among Ukrainian immigrants and refugees. So both clinical symptoms that we've assessed in this study. And now, a different context that a little bit allows to assess some more of causality here. This is a context of LGBT studies that we've done on an LGBT community. We've done such studies in Italy and in Poland. Looking at in these two studies, these were actually two quite independent studies done by two of my MA students. One of them studied in Italy, so she conducted the study in Italy. Another studied in Poland. So you can see the studies are quite different, but one thing is very common. The studies were experimental. So we basically presented people with many comments from internet in the two sets of comments. In one set of comment, the comment included some of the hate speech examples, and in the second condition, participants have read many comments that did not include any derogatory statements. And in this experimental studies, and after we came back to them and we've measured the general well-being, satisfaction with life scale. And we looked at people who are highly identifying members of LGBT community, so like activists and so on, and people who have lower levels of identification. And we found that actually the problem of hate speech we've seen mostly among people who are at high levels of identification. So people who strongly identified with being gay or lesbian or generally with LGBT community, when they were exposed to hate speech, the hate speech would really lower their level of well-being. And this was first small experiment conducted in Italy. And then another student wanted to study this problem in Poland, so we worked with students who are members of LGBT community, and we really tried to make these studies as ethically correct. So there was a lot of support provided to participant in these studies. And in Poland is a very interesting case in this respect, because Poland has very discriminatory laws against LGBT. So basically, there is no recognition of civil partnerships. There is no recognition of gay rights in Polish law at all. And even some communities like Kasznik in this case declared itself to be LGBT-free zones. So we have these municipalities that signed the declaration that they would be free of LGBT propaganda, etc., as they named it. And we found in the study, when we presented derogatory statements against LGBT people among comments presented to participants, again in Poland, we looked here on negative and positive affect using a classical PANAS scale. And we found the effect of negative affect mostly to be visible among high identifiers. So those LGBT people who are strongly identified, when they are exposed to hate speech, their general well-being deteriorates, and the negative affect is a dominant reaction. So and we found very similar pattern in studies conducted in Italy by Mauro Bianchi, who also did experimental studies on hate speech, presenting gay people with hate speech versus with non-derogatory labels, so either category labels or homophobic labels. And again, he found out that among those gay people who are, he called them high coming out people, so basically people who are open with their identity, who are expressing their gay identity, this was particularly dangerous for them. So when they were exposed to homophobic comments, the internalized homophobia would increase, right? So they would be mostly targeted by hate speech, and the hate speech would have largest consequences for those people who are, again, more expressing their identity, so they're probably more strongly identified. And the second argument that I think we as psychologists could provide to this debate is the argument about the similarity of mechanisms to other forms of aggression. So what do we know from aggression research, from the general model of aggression of Brad Bashman and Craig Anderson, for example, how aggression works? When we are exposed to aggression, when we see, for example, violent media, violent TV shows, or violent contents on the internet, or where we are exposed to everyday violence during conflict, it changes our cognition, changes our affect, but there are two very important mechanisms here. Desensitization to violence. It destroys our sensitivity to violence. We start treating violence as something normal. We do not react emotionally to violence. We stop being sensitive to that. And the second mechanism is the deficit of empathy. It lowers our empathy to the victims of violence. And ultimately, it makes us more prone to commit aggressive behavior ourselves, right? So this is how the exposure to violence generates or increases potential for aggressive behavior. And this was found in many contexts, in people exposed to violent images, video games, movies, and TV, internet. Most of these studies looked at psychophysiological measures, so found it on a very, very basic psychophysiological measures. And we've studied this also in the context of hate speech. So we thought that contact with hate speech also would decrease lower sensitivity to hate speech. People will stop consider hate speech as something dangerous, something threatening. They will normalize it, and ultimately once they get used to hate speech, once this desensitization will occur, people will start using hate speech themselves. It will increase their prejudice, and they will justify violence. And this is what we found in many studies. Here, the case of large sample correlational studies, where we found that, in fact, people who are more exposed to hate speech, their sensitivity to hate speech would be lower, so they will start treating hate speech as something normal, and this would justify prejudice and different anti-immigrant attitudes. And we found that in numerous correlational studies. But then we thought, okay, correlational studies, that's not a very strong evidence, so we thought about doing experimental studies on that. And here we are looking on majority groups, so the ones who are producing hate speech, the ones who are from the groups that are discriminating against minorities. And we did this exposure phase. So we did as bogus cognitive tasks. Participants were thinking that the task is about remembering comments from internet if they are written with different fonts and different colors. So how the typesetting of contents affects memory processes. But in this task, one condition always included derogatory statements that were hate speech. And the second group received statements that did not include derogatory comments. And then we did a measurement phase where participants were asked to rate the offensiveness of statements. So we asked them, so in both cases, in both conditions, we presented them hate speech. So we presented hate speech to people who were not previously exposed to hate speech and to the ones that were exposed to hate speech for a long time. And we asked them to rate whether certain examples that we presented to them is hate speech in fact or not. And then we measured other consequences, basically prejudice, whether they would accept minorities as neighbors, as coworkers, etc. And again, we found the same, that participants who were exposed to hate speech for a long time, they will not recognize hate speech as something threatening, as something offensive. They will start treating hate speech as something normal, and this would increase ultimately their prejudice. Recently, we found this on more basic physiological levels. So again, we had the same training phase. So we presented to people to hate speech for a long time or not. And then there was this measurement phase where we recorded heart rate. And we looked at this initial deceleration, which shows a strong emotional reaction. So in heart rate activity, when you see something very emotional, you have this initial deceleration of heart rate. And this is something we found only when we presented hate speech initially to people who were not previously exposed to hate speech. For people, so those people whom here we rate as neutral. So these are people who didn't see hate speech before. Now we present hate speech to them, and we see the deceleration. For people who were presented to hate speech very frequently, so who are seeing a lot of hate speech before, when they see subsequent hate speech, they do not react with this deceleration. So they probably are not reacting very effectively to that. And the final result that I wanted to share with you is the study that we've recently done on empathy. And this is a study we've done in collaboration with neuroscientists that was particularly looking at empathy, and particularly one region that is related to the structure TPJ, temporal parental junction, which is related to people's ability to take perspective of other people's. And we wanted to see whether people who are exposed for a long time to hate speech, so again, we use the same training phase. We presented people with hate speech for a long time versus not. So we had the second condition of people who are not exposed to hate speech for a long time. And then we presented them with a situation, a painful situation. They were observing a painful situation of other individuals who were either in-group or out-group members. And we found here that actually completely regardless of whether they observed in-group of an out-group member, we found the very same effect, that people who were previously exposed to hate speech, they would react with less empathic reaction when they are seeing pain than people who were not previously exposed to hate speech. So this initial brain imaging study shows that hate speech might in fact destroy empathy, but not only out-group empathy, not only empathy to the groups that are victims of hate speech, but it might lead to certain maybe emotional empathic numbing effect, that people are generally reacting in a less empathic way. And I think this might be this more general consequence of hate speech, which should lead us to treating hate speech as something, as a form of as a really destructive phenomenon in political life. Okay, so basically, what we can, to sum it up, what we can say based on these psychological studies is that both arguments that I presented here probably suggest that hate speech has severe consequences for targeted minorities. So it really affects mental health of minorities, and it's very similar in mechanism to other forms of aggression. So the same destruction of empathy and desensitization that we know from other forms of violence, it also occurs when people are exposed for a long time to hate speech. And this should be our argument probably to limit somehow hate speech. But I don't think that legal regulations are the only way to confront hate speech. And I believe that also confronting hate speech in our everyday life, reacting to that might be equally, maybe not equally, but also effective way of dealing with the problems. So the legal regulations are not the only way in which we can deal with this problem. And my time is out, so I will not say more about it, but maybe in the discussion, if you want to continue that, I can tell you something more about some experiments that we've been doing about the effectiveness of confronting haters. So we use some artificial intelligence in our studies to confront haters and to see whether their behavior can be changed by reaction of another account, right? By somebody who's intervening, and not just by the regulators, not just by the moderators of the contents on social media. So thank you very much.
Great. Well, I would like to invite you, Kath, to come up, and we now enter the experimental free speech and hate speech portion as a lived experience where we can now speak to each other. No, I'm just kidding. Please let me welcome Professor Gelber back to the podium to react to your talk, Michal, Professor Bilewicz, and then you can react to hers. Go ahead, please.
Thank you. That was very enlightening, and I'm actually really delighted to see all that really wonderful empirical research that supports the arguments around hate speech harming. Obviously we use very different methods. Mine have been pretty much exclusively qualitative, but the experimental stuff is really insightful, and the other, the studies you've done are very insightful. So thank you for introducing me to those. Just a couple of things to say about some broader comments that you made. Firstly, you opened with Twitter and Elon Musk, and mentioned the content moderation and how changeable it is. And it is very changeable, but it's also, in my opinion, really poorly done. I don't think it's a secret to say that, but one of the problems with the companies themselves doing content moderation is that they do it really badly, and they do it really badly for lots of reasons. But one of the reasons is that two of the reasons are their entire business model is premised on clicks. You get more clicks, the more upset people are. So they have monetized. They have very successfully, because they're really big companies, they have monetized this kind of behaviour, and they make enormous profits out of it. The second problem is that their business model is global. So they have one definition of hate speech. They have a book that's apparently about that thick that all the moderators use to try and implement this one definition of hate speech and the other forms of content that they moderate. Hate speech obviously isn't the only content they try to moderate. And that means that they get things wrong all the time. They don't have enough. They're trying to get more information from the local context. They have teams in a variety of countries. Not everybody is in the same place who does the content moderation, but they're really bad at it because, again, they're global. They have this global business model that is in direct contradiction to their need to take context into account in order to be able to understand the real impact of hate speech. So there are lots of reasons why they're particularly bad at content moderation, as well, of course, as being inconsistent. And of course, the third part of the content moderation is that there are some poor human, a lot of it's done with AI, of course, but in the end, a decent proportion of those either reports of content that violates their standards or the stuff that was initially picked up through AI ends up in front of a human being. And the conditions for those human beings, the working conditions for those human beings are horrendous. They are exposed to this material just constantly in their work environment without sufficient support. So that's all problematic. The second thing was that you mentioned briefly that you contrasted the First Amendment to the relevant article in the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. Just to give you a sort of a nice anecdote on how much more complex this whole debate has become over the years. In 1982, the United Nations released what they call a general statement on Article 19, which is the free speech provision of the International Convention on Civil and Political Rights. A general statement is the United Nations guidance on how to interpret the meaning of this clause in international law. Article 19 is the free speech clause of the International Convention on Civil and Political Rights, and is also the title of an NGO based in the UK called Article 19, which seeks to preserve free speech. The general statement released in 1982 was 1.5 pages long. They released an updated general statement much more recently than that, sometime in the 2000s. It may have been 2006, 2009, I can't remember the exact date. It was 32 pages long. Mm-hmm. So this field is obviously very complex. Two final comments. You said in your experiments, Michael, that you had differentiated between people who had been exposed to hate speech and people who hadn't before. I found that very interesting because I think it's becoming increasingly difficult to find people who say they haven't been exposed to hate speech. The surveys, I've just in fact conducted a new survey myself, which is not published yet, but the incidents we asked as an entry question to the survey, have you either been targeted by or witnessed hate speech online in the last 12 months? And we had 5 countries, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, US, UK. 40% said yes. 40%. It's the highest result I've ever seen, actually. And we were expecting, it was counterintuitive, we were expecting to get we used a narrow definition, a tight definition. We were expecting to get a smaller result than other surveys, and we got a higher result than other surveys. And the only reason and then we controlled for false positives by asking people the ground on which they believed that hate speech had occurred. And so we took out what we described as false positives, and we still ended up with 40%, which I think is extraordinary. And then finally, just to conclude, I completely agree with you that legal regulation ought not to be the only approach, and in some cases, not even the primary approach. And I'm a big fan of the civil law approach that we have in Australia, which is quite different from the criminal law approach in many other countries. We have criminal laws too, but they're almost never used, 6 times since 1989. So overwhelmingly in Australia, it's the civil laws that are used, which allows you to complain to a human rights authority, and it's a very, very, very different approach. So I think that legal regulation is part of the toolkit, but I absolutely agree with you that it's not the entirety of the toolkit and that other elements are needed. The problem I have, however, there are lots of issues, but I do have a problem with relying on counter speech because it places an unfair burden on targets to respond. It can be their allies who respond. It doesn't have to be targets themselves who respond, but it places an unfair burden on those targets who feel that they're compelled to respond. And also it overrides that constitutive silencing idea that I talked about before. So it's not, we're not starting from a level playing field. If people are already feeling those kind of pressures, then it's more difficult for them to engage in counter speech. But thank you.
Great. Thank you for those insightful comments. Sorry, let me get back to the mic. Thank you for those insightful comments. And now I want to invite you, Michael, to speak about what you heard and the thoughts you have reflecting on Professor Gelber's presentation.
Thank you very much. I think that Professor Gelber really showed some very important limitations of what psychology, how psychology also could contribute to this distinction, to this debate of hate speech versus free speech. And even considering my own research that I've been talking about here, I really think that one of these big limitations is about establishing causality. I've shown you some experimental studies, but of course, they're problematic also for ethical grounds, right? So exposing people to hate speech for a long time. And when I said that we compared them to a group which was not previously exposed, you're absolutely right that these people are probably also exposed outside of the laboratory, right? But basically, we didn't expose them within this training phase, right? In the study. And this is what also we observe in our survey studies, that we have very, very large proportion of the population which is exposed to hate speech. And after this so-called immigration crisis in Europe in 2015, 2016, which was basically a large anti-immigrant panic rather than a crisis, it was just very much a crisis of hate speech rather than anything else. We at that time we did studies of adolescents, and we found that we didn't ask them about hate speech, because in Poland everybody would say that they experience hate speech. They would say that they experience anti-Polish or anti-Christian hate speech, right? So anti-majority hate speech. So we never ask this question like that, but we present examples of statements that were considered to be offensive by minorities themselves. So in all of these studies, we did we are doing this kind of pre-testing with minority groups, where we present them with certain statements, and we pick only the ones that are considered to them very harmful, based on their very harmful to their collective identity, to their collective well-being, and then we present those statements to majority group members or to minorities again, and we ask them how often they were exposed to that. And in 2016, when we looked at this anti-Muslim Islamophobic hate speech, I remember that there was, I think, 76 or 80% of young people who said that they have witnessed that on the internet recently. So from that time, we thought, okay, this is just everybody. Yes, so everybody is immersed in this reality full of hate speech. So of course, this is hard now to create good control conditions, right, in our experimental studies, because everybody has witnessed that. We try to do some work with artificial groups now, but again, I have some problems whether doing research on using artificial groups and artificial scenarios is really legitimate when we try to develop theories about the real world events, about real world social issues. And finally, our reactions. You mentioned now in the discussion, that civil code and civil legislations can be more effective than a penal code in this case, and I have some problems with it living in a country in which authoritarian party which uses hate speech is in power currently, because for example, strategic litigations against hate speech are quite rare. They still have been effective because we have independent judiciary. That's okay, but it costs a lot, right? So not many non-profit organizations can really afford to do that in a really effective way. But on the contrary, the so-called GONGOs, the governmental, non-governmental organizations, so the NGOs that are supported by the government, they are using a lot of strategic litigation against the people who are trying to combat hate speech. And to even after one of the conferences where I presented some examples of anti-Semitic hate speech, I've been sued by a right-wing extremist cartoonist for using his cartoons as examples of anti-Semitism. And it ended with 2 years of trial, and it was a civil trial. It was not a penal trial. It was a civil trial. It was basically a lawsuit. I mean, the final judgment was that I can, that is, as a researcher of hate speech, of course, I can use iconographic material, and And so I didn't have to pay anything ultimately. And luckily, I had a pro bono lawyers who helped me in this case. But this might be very dangerous to people who are actually trying to confront this in a society when there is a completely unequal access to resources, where you have a government which is on the side of haters. The government would support different people and nonprofit organizations in such lawsuits. So it is complicated, and I just hope that this is a problem, right? Because if we have a government which is supporting hate speech and using hate speech in order to get their electoral support, then confrontations become more and more difficult. And this is why I thought about some forms of civic activism. And of course, there's a common thinking that you shouldn't feed the trolls, right? So any interaction with the hater is dangerous somehow because it feeds the troll. But we found something different, actually, that in many cases, those haters are living in their bubble. They are not really interacting with anybody else than themselves or the members of their groups. And just breaking this isolation can somehow have some positive effect and lead to change in the behavior. And we have a recent article in Aggressive Behavior when we are showing some intervention that shows that you can actually reduce the activity, hostile activity of the online haters just by interacting. But of course, it's costly, and I don't want to put this burden on anybody because it's a psychological cost. But if you feel psychologically secure, sometimes it's good to interact with those people who are posting hateful comments on the internet. And of course, masses of them are just bots, so interaction with them would not make any sense. But with those who are just real people, the interaction might make sense. Thank you.
Fantastic insights, and I could listen to you guys for another 16 minutes, but I do want to tokenly comment as a panel chair and then invite the audience to engage. I'll just mention, some of you know, but I also have been targeted with a slap suit from a violent extremist group because I labeled them a violent extremist group, and they were based in the United States, and they sent that letter through to us here in Australia. And I believe the university shelled out thousands of dollars to retain an American lawyer, a free speech expert. And I'm told that this is increasingly common and that academics are seeing more and more of it. So just the ways that groups use the kind of laws to try and target the people that speak about them, ironically. Free speech advocates who use the laws, so-called. Anyways, I could go on about that, but I guess I wanted to invite both of you to reflect on the question of power that you've both mentioned, because that's something that you haven't brought or centered, I thought, in your analysis. But Kath, you mentioned that, in your opinion, it would be inappropriate to consider as hate speech an advantaged group that, almost by definition you were saying, and I think you alluded to this also, Michal, hate speech, the concept of hate speech shouldn't be used to extend to people who are expressing hostility to advantaged groups. In my own research, which focuses on conflict and violence, I would say that it is definitely possible to have violence soliciting speech directed at advantaged groups. And so I was just wondering what you would think about that and how you would engage that boundary in your theorizing or in your data or both, or whether you just wouldn't touch it with a barge pole. So I'm going to ask you, Kath, to come back to the screen and riff about that. And then while these folks are speaking, I invite our audience to think about their insightful question.
Thank you. So that's a great question. In my view, there is a lot of really horrible, disgusting speech in the world that doesn't constitute hate speech. So violence eliciting speech, as you described, is incitement. It's a criminal offence, and it's horrible for lots of reasons. And I wouldn't condone it, and I wouldn't support it, and I wouldn't say it should be completely free of consequence. But it should be, in that particular example that you use it, the consequence should be that it was incitement of a crime. If it's violence inciting speech, it's inciting assault. That's a criminal offence. And so I'd like to see it treated as such. Yeah. So, yeah, I did imply, and in fact am of the view that by definition, hate speech isn't what you use to describe even really nasty, horrible speech that's against a dominant group, because that takes away from the systemic discrimination aspect of it that renders certain people vulnerable to what we might call hate speech. I appreciate very much that out in the world that is not understood at all, and that people use the word hate and haters, not in the way Michal did, but in a very capacious way. And so people talk about being subjected to hate because of, I don't know, everything from the colour of their hair to, redheads, for example, or, or the way they dress. And in the absence of a connection to systemic discrimination, I'd describe that as something else that might well be mean and nasty and horrible and really unpleasant psychologically for the target to experience, but it doesn't fall within that particular category, in my opinion, of hate speech. Otherwise, the category becomes too large. And because I'm a supporter of some legal intervention, although I appreciate very much what you said, Michal, and it's obviously very difficult in the situation you describe is very difficult, and I don't support it, obviously. That is a very difficult situation. But because generally speaking, I'm not a person who says that laws have no place in this space. Therefore, I believe very, very strongly that the laws need to be crafted as narrowly and as specifically as possible to avoid abuse of the law and to avoid over breadth of the law. And so the things you're describing, Michal, are just abuse of the law, right? There's no way that hate speech provisions should be used by dominant groups in the ways that you've described, and also similarly the slap suits, although they're not designed to protect free speech, but they're a deliberate strategy. Slap suits, there's plenty of scholarship on slap suits and then being used as a deliberate strategy to silence people.
Yeah. And Michal?
Yeah, obviously high status groups, the powerful groups have the effects of hate speech on these groups would be much less pronounced, of course, because if somebody offends me as being, I don't know, Caucasian male, it's not affecting me because of the high status, of the high power of my group. Because this is what we know from social identity theory, right? The high status or high power of certain group gives you a lot of psychological resources, right? Of your advantage over others, and for example, also leading to mental health consequences. Also, being a member of advantage group is completely different situation from being a member of disadvantaged group, and this is exactly what I consider to be this constitutive aspect that Professor Gelber mentioned, that it puts the group that is otherwise discriminated into even in more inferior position, right? Hate speech itself builds the status inequalities, right? So it's not a consequence of hate speech, but it's inherited. And I very like this term, because it shows the nature of hate speech. So not something to be addressed in psychological studies, but something which is a nature of this phenomenon itself, that it enhances this inequality, right? So I think that this is very important in this power discussion. Thanks.
Wonderful. Now, it's our tradition at UQ to invite a student to ask the first question. If there are any students that would like to ask a question, this time is for you, and then our panel will reflect on it. I think that's you, Chris, in the chat, right? That's not someone asking a question. After a decent interval to allow the students, if any, to put their hands up, we will now. Oh, well done, well done. Welcome. Yeah.
Well, thank you. It was nice to ask a question when it's been invited. There's no fear or less fear. But we've heard rather compelling arguments, like from the psychological side, that the constitutional argument in political science that actually brings true. Like there are actual effects to hate speech on individuals. And apart from that, political science, this might not best at engaging with psychological research, moving its back their claims up. Would it be beneficial if that happened? Like, would it be beneficial if we regulated based on individual experiences, given that we are in such a mass area?
Wonderful. I'll just repeat that in case, could you hear that, Michal? You could hear it?
No, unfortunately not. So
Yeah,
if somebody wants to, next questions come closer, right?
The question was from what sounded like a political science student, that it's fantastic to see that the psychological evidence is very much in line with the concept from political science that hate speech can in and of itself be, harmful, constitutive of harm. And can this be brought into the policy space so that this evidence is used to inform policy? A comment I might make just while I'm speaking is that the minority stress literature in the United States has been used in policy to regulate discrimination, and the minority stress literature has shown changing illness and mortality patterns as a function of discrimination in laws. And I wonder if that's something that you guys would connect to, but over to you now to comment on the student's question rather than my point.
So it is already in countries that have hate speech regulation, or at least countries that have hate speech regulation that is directed, generally speaking, towards the protection of minorities, like Australia. It is already. So that the reason that there was obviously a big argument around free speech when these laws were introduced. And there are big exemptions in the laws designed to help protect free speech. So, for example, in the Queensland law, there is an exemption for fair reporting. So journalism is protected, artistic speech, scientific endeavour, and public and general public debate. There are huge exemptions in these laws, and they're designed to protect free speech. But the recognition in countries like Australia, if you go back to the debates around the introduction of these laws in Australia, in each jurisdiction and also federally when it happened in 1995, first one happened in 1989, all of those debates recognise the harms of hate speech. They don't use the word constitutive, but they all recognise those harms. And that was the central justification. We had in 1991 in Australia a national inquiry into racist violence, which absolutely put the argument that, and you can still get the report in the library, absolutely put the argument that there was, particularly for Indigenous Australians, but also for immigrant communities, that there was a causal relationship between the verbal abuse they suffered and the other forms of discrimination that they suffered, including violence. Obviously, the focus of the report was on violence. And that was one of the reports that led to the federal amendment of legislation in 1995 that gave us the Section 18C of the Federal Racial Discrimination Act. Some of that is now being undermined by, as Michal said, the fact that dominant groups are now claiming victimisation. So they're claiming discrimination, they're claiming victimisation, they're claiming their free speech is being imperilled by being disagreed with. I just can't make sense of that argument that somehow if you disagree with somebody, you're abrogating their free speech rights, but that's what they posit. So the whole idea that, that's why the systemic discrimination connection is important, one of the reasons why it's important. But I think what we're seeing now, sort of 20, 30 years on, it's in Australia, the first law was in 1989. So we've had these laws for a really long time. And the risk now is not that they don't appreciate that the harm, they do. The risk now is that dominant groups are claiming they're harmed. And I don't support that claim at all.
Michal?
Yeah, so I think that such policies are also visible in my country, and we have actually 2 articles of the penal code that prevent hate speech. It's not about hate speech; it's about derogating, offending people based on their ethnicity, religion, etc. The problem is when you have promoters of hate speech in power, because our prosecutors and our police is never using this particular article of penal code. So this is basically a dead law. I don't know if you can say so in English, but the law that doesn't really operate. It is. You could probably use it, but much depends on the behavior of prosecutors and police. So this is why it's very much shaped by democratic processes and by people's electoral decisions, right? Thanks.
Well, I think that even though I'm sure that there are insightful comments from academics, we might not need to respect our panel's time because we are coming up to 6:30. I would like to invite everyone here to join me in applauding the panel. What a brilliant talk for both of you. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much. And if anybody has some questions, just write me, right? I mean, I can send my email maybe on chat, and that's or Winifred can distribute it so that we can continue the conversation that way.
Yeah, and if
Thank
you take a
very much.
picture or a screenshot of Michael's name, you'll be able to find his email online, because we're going to log out of the chat fairly quickly,
yeah.
Michael. But thank you both. Thank you for the audience for coming on a very late time, and it's in the high 30s here. And can I say, when we started, all of us in the room were experiencing a lot of heat in Australia, physically as well as morally and emotionally. All right. Thanks again, everyone. And thanks to the Zoomers. I'm going to log out now. Bye now.